where my Aunt Teresa was now teaching at Norfolk State. G got her degree, got her master's degree, and became a special needs teacher and later principal. The point of these stories is that these were people who would do anything to educate their children. They believed fundamentally in the transforming power of education. Now that was then, of course, passed on to my family as well. My parents were themselves educators. They were in some ways ordinary people. My mother was a school teacher. She taught first English, and one of her first students was the great ball player Willie Mays at Fairfield Industrial High School. Now, Willie Mays told me that he remembered my mother very well because she had told him, son, you're going to be a ball player, and if you need to leave class a little bit early, you go right ahead and do that. And he obviously appreciated this insight by my mother. My father was a high school athletic director, later on a high school guidance counselor and Presbyterian minister. But they were dedicated to the proposition that I think W.E.B. Du Bois would have concurred with, that yes, there could be a talented 10th, but they were absolutely determined that that talented 10th would have no class implication. And so what they wanted to do was to look for kids who could succeed regardless of their circumstances. In my little black middle-class community of Titusville, we were a community of two-parent families, mostly teachers, one lawyer, one doctor. It perhaps isn't surprising that the children in my community all knew that we were going to go to college. In fact, the messages were so strong about going to college that sometimes you just wanted to say, all right, I get it, I'm going to college. I remember that my parents, for instance, when we would go on family trips, we would go and visit college campuses. We once went 150 miles out of the way to see Ohio State. Now, we visited college campuses like most people visited national parks. They were trying to send very strong messages, but the message in Titusville was not, do you want to go to college? It was, where are you going to college? And that was very strong. But perhaps not so surprising for our little community. More surprising for the kids outside of our little community who weren't so fortunate as to have educated parents. Like his father, my father was a minister and had a church in Birmingham, Westminster Presbyterian Church, which is still there. It celebrated its 65th anniversary last month. And behind Westminster Presbyterian Church, there was a place called Loveman Village. It was a government project, as we called it back in the day. And those children were very much the target of my father's educational evangelism. Through his youth fellowship, a program in which he brought kids from all over the community to his church at 4 o'clock every Sunday. And by the way, he had an advantage because my father was a Presbyterian. Unlike the Baptists, he could have dances at his church and often did to attract students. But much of what youth fellowship did was to make the educational experience available to more than just the community. This was actually fairly controversial in his middle-class church. The members believed that these programs really ought to be for the children of the church, not for the children of Loveman Village. They therefore, my father's elders, the ruling body of the Presbyterian Church, defunded his, as they called it, social ministry. He then went to the women of the church and had his ministry funded. So this ministry, as he saw it, of educational outreach became very key. Every Tuesday and Thursday night at Westminster was tutoring night. Teachers coming from Ullman High School and other high schools and tutoring in algebra and tutoring in chemistry and tutoring in languages so that these kids could have an education that my father thought worthy and an education that would make up for the frankly fairly poor state of black schools in Birmingham, Alabama. Not only that, but like his father, he went door to door with scholarships in hand for children who were smart, as he would put it. And the list of kids that were produced out of this community is really quite remarkable. Kids like Freeman Rabowski, who grew up down the street from me, who is currently the president of the University of Maryland, Baltimore, the current president of the University of Missouri, Kansas City, a woman who was the first black governor of the IMF under Ronald Reagan, a woman who is a Pulitzer Prize winner Pulitzer Prize winner and columnist, Cheryl McCarthy, and also the first National Achievement Scholar in the state of Alabama, the head of the largest trauma unit in the country, King's Hospital in Los Angeles, and on and on and on. But among them, too, were kids who came from Loveland Village. The woman who headed the entire Birmingham public library system, one of these young women who was sent to college by this community and by this church. A Pulitzer Prize winner who also credits the fact that he had 5 siblings and his father died when he was very young, crediting this church for his success. And so the talented 10th, as Du Bois would have called them, were not just the children of the privileged middle class. They were the children also who showed promise and were able to take advantage of the educational opportunities offered to them. Now, educational empowerment was for this community more than just a moral cause. It was also quite instrumental. You see, growing up in the circumstances of the segregated South, where you couldn't go to a restaurant, where your parents had to find a way to tell you that the reason you couldn't go to that movie theater was that you were black, where your parents had to explain why it was, as little friend of mine, parents had to, that you couldn't go to Kittyland. You can imagine that that might have been an environment in which people felt oppressed and victimized, marginalized, and where horizons would have been limited. Well, education was, from their point of view, the answer to that. Because if you could speak English better than they did, meaning the white man, if you could recite their literature better than they did, if you could play their music better than they did, then they might not like you, but they had to respect you. And you could build a life that was fulfilling and productive and a life of dignity. And therefore, for the families and the people of segregated Birmingham, education was a kind of armor against racism and prejudice that allowed them to build this productive and dignified life. They believed that you might not be able to control these circumstances, but you could control your response, and you were better able to control your response if you were educated. In these communities, the highest regard was held for teachers and for principals. If you were a teacher in the Birmingham public school system, oh my goodness, you had arrived. The day that a family learned that their son or daughter had received a teaching job was a happy one for them. And you should have seen the event that was the New Teachers Conference every year, held at the Civic Center in Birmingham with every teacher, every new teacher in suit and tie, the women in hats and gloves. It was quite a moment for the Birmingham community. And oh, by the way, as my uncle found out, it was also a great way to meet a mate. That's how my uncle met his wife at the New Teachers Conference. The principals were even more gigantic figures. People like Mr. R.C. Johnson, the principal of Parker High School, the largest high school in Birmingham, and the father of Alma Johnson Powell, Colin Powell's wife, and Mr. George C. Bell, her uncle, by the way, who was the principal of Ullman High School. And even the principals of elementary schools were considered towering figures, like Mr. W. W. Whetstone. When Mr. Whetstone unexpectedly died of a heart attack, the funeral that was held for him rivaled anything that you would see for a great political figure now. My point in relaying this is that the profession of educating was also valued above all else. You had a few doctors and you had a few lawyers, but not so many in the segregated South. But to be a teacher, this was the highest calling. In return, these teachers expected the best of their students. To be in a classroom where you were told you will have to be twice as good, not as a matter of debate, but as a matter of fact. Teachers expected the highest performance. They tried to help those who could not perform, but the high standards were held, you were held to account to high standards. You were told there are no victims and no excuses. Now, this narrative that I've related to you, I hope helps people to understand why in a place like Birmingham, with all of those circumstances of prejudice, all of those circumstances of limited horizons, so many very, very successful people emerged. And it says something about our challenge today in making certain that the talented 10th are not just the children of the educated and the children of the well-heeled, but in fact that education as the great equalizer is available so that the talented 10th represents a broad section of the United States and a broad section of our diversity and within the race. It's essential for the United States that this be true. And of course, the key to this is K-12 education and whether or not children are actually able to access those educational benefits. Today, I have to say, I am concerned about this when I can look at your zip code and tell whether or not you're going to get a good education. And I will tell you that this is terrifying to me. First, it's terrifying to me as an educator because I realize that without access to education, we are never going to know whether the potential of the person who might have found the cure for cancer is being sacrificed because they never had that chance. It is, for me, terrifying as an educator because I love to stand in front of a class at Stanford, and I'm sure you can do so at Harvard, and see that on the one hand, there is a fourth-generation Stanford legatee, and sitting next to that kid is an itinerant farm worker's son. Now, without a K-12 education, and I mean public school education, the chance that that will continue to be the composition of a class for Stanford or for Harvard is very slim. That will mean that for the United States of America, and here my concern goes from being that of an educator to being that of a former Secretary of State, it means that our competitiveness as a country is clearly at risk, and our ability and willingness to be open to the world is clearly at risk. You see, if we try to hold on to the days when the $18 an hour unskilled labor job was the way that you made a decent living in the United States, we're not going to be able to do it. The truth is that the United States occupies in the global economy that upper tier where knowledge and the ability to create and innovate is at the core of whether or not you're going to get a good job. Ask the people on Route 128, ask the people in the Silicon Valley if they can find enough engineers, and they will tell you no. And so somehow, the creation of an educational system in which people can get the skills that they need is very important. Otherwise, the United States will not lead, it will turn inward, it will try to protect, and we will never be able to protect as effectively as others can protect. And the economic pie will get smaller, not larger. And so as former Secretary of State, I worry about the competitiveness of the United States and the willingness of the United States to look outward and to lead. So as an educator, it's the lost potential. As a former Secretary of State, it's the loss of leadership. But as an American, I worry about one other thing. This great national myth that it does not matter where you came from, it matters where you're going, that you can come from humble circumstances and you can do great things, is what unites Americans. America is an idea. It's not, as we discussed yesterday, a nation state. To be an American is to be from multiple ethnic and national backgrounds. It's to be from multiple religious backgrounds or no religion at all.